So good day everyone, and welcome to our weekday sitting here at Redwood City, California, here at this earth. And as introduction to the theme today of kind of final talk on the second noble truth, I want to mention that what we do with our mind sometimes is influenced by the metaphors we use. So, for example, I have a tendency to use the word deep, deepening, in reference to meditation. Meditation can go deep. I had a very deep meditation, for example. Some people might refer to the same thing as by metaphors of height, of higher states of consciousness, for example. Maybe I like deep because I associate it with having the roots deeply embedded in the earth. And but the awareness is neither high or deep or shallow, or awareness in and of itself just is. We also use the metaphors of movement for awareness of the mind. My mind wandered off, and then we bring it back, or we direct our mind, or place your mind on your breathing, or these kinds of metaphors of movement. But the mind doesn't ever move anywhere. It's always in the same place. There's a certain way in which then we believe the metaphors. The metaphors then are useful, but then the metaphors can then also influence how we think about the mind and limit our experience of the mind and what's possible. And so when sitting in meditation sometimes, it's useful to let go of all the metaphors that we use for the nature of awareness, for what the mind is, and to appreciate that in the freedom of the mind doesn't move. It doesn't lean forward, even though it might feel sometimes that we're reaching out for something or pulling back from something. That might be very subtle movements of the muscles in the body. The awareness, the simplest form of knowing itself, doesn't move at all. And it's a kind of lack of movement that maybe is inspiring when it's the clear, really clear, unmoving air, like in the early morning, maybe over a very still lake, mountain lake, and the air around is just completely still and, kind of full of potential and kind of alive in a certain way, but there's no movement in the air. The mind can have this vitality in its non-moving nature. It's not frozen or limited, or it's more unlimited. So to sit physically upright as a metaphor for the mind, where we sit upright and we don't lean towards something, we don't collapse, we don't lean away from anything, we're not trying to get anything, we're not trying to resist anything, but rather just sitting, upright, just present in a dignified, clear way, without being for or against anything. It's what the body can do in meditation. And as the body is, so it's pointing to the possibility of the mind also. Have a certain kind of vibrant stillness, where the mind doesn't give in to the desires, or the leaning into the future, or the mind doesn't give in to pulling back or resisting. The mind just is. Awareness just is. If anything, awareness is and has more of a receptive feeling than it does an active going out or pulling away kind of experience. So with that as an introduction, if this makes sense to you, and if it doesn't, just you don't have to worry about it. It's taking a posture, and it can be any posture that works for you, but either literally because you're sitting upright, or metaphorically, figuratively, that you are taking a posture where you can be kind of psychologically or spiritually upright, where there's a kind of little bit of strength in the body, or intentionality, like, yes, I'm taking this posture. Yes, this is the posture for meditation. And this yes to this uprightness that feels itself connected, maybe even rooted, to the place in which you're meditating. Feeling rooted, your bottom against your seat, if you're sitting in a chair or cushion. If your feet are touching the floor, feeling the contact, clear, definitive contact of the feet here. And then rising up or coming out of this place of contact with what supports the weight of the body. A clarity of presence. Yes, here the body is. Perhaps it's helpful, especially if you're sitting upright, to open up space between the last vertebrae of the spine and the skull. And to open that space by lifting the back of the head ever so slightly up and tucking the chin down and back. And then below that openness, feeling the spine, the back rib cage, feeling the spine all the way down to the lower spine and down to the sitting bones. And there might be some movement, vibration, teeny bit of swaying in the body. That's okay. But in addition, you might feel the inner stillness of the body that's also there. And with that stillness as a reference point, ever so slightly adjust your posture so that you have a feeling of being balanced, not leaning forward, not leaning back. Not leaning into the world, not pulling back from it. Just here. Beginning of the inhale. Relaxing into the inhale, allowing it to happen. And feeling the movements of the rib cage as you breathe, front rib cage and back. Maybe the movement of the belly. And while the experience of breathing is often one of movement, there might also be in the middle of that movement of breathing, middle of the body. Also a stillness, something which doesn't move. Movement and non-movement together. Non-movement that maybe even highlights the movement. Movement that highlights the non-movement. Also, as you exhale, relaxing the thinking muscle. Maybe kind of relaxing that's also an opening up more fully to the experience of breathing. And then see if you can feel or sense whatever stillness there might be in the mind, even if there are thoughts and activities of the mind. Perhaps also within it, there's also a place where the mind is rooted, upright, still, not leaning forward or leaning back. Not going out, not pulling back. When the mind so-called wanders off, no need to bring the mind back. Just open up to the awareness that's already present, to receive again the breathing. No need to direct the mind or move the mind back to the breathing. Open the mind to receive the experience of breathing again. And in so doing, letting the mind be still. A certain kind of vibrant stillness where the mind does not reach forward to want something, pull back to avoid anything. Where knowing just knows. Awareness is just aware. Where the mind just is. Allowing all things to happen within it. But the mind itself doesn't have to move. Maybe it's a little bit like there can be waves on the surface of the ocean, but the ocean floor is still, quiet, peaceful. In a sense, the ocean floor holds and allows for the movements of the waves, but the ocean floor doesn't move because of it. And whenever you notice your mind moving, going towards or away from anything, it's okay, but use that as an occasion to relax, to open, to allow the mind to rest in an open stillness, an open awareness. That receives or allows experience to appear. If you notice the mind is moving towards holding on to thoughts, pulling away, see if you can let the mind, the awareness, be at rest, relaxing the moving muscle. So there's nothing you have to accomplish or do except to allow the natural awareness of the mind to know and experience this moment, what's really happening in the obvious and simple ways of now. We talk about the past, the present, and the future. The present never moves. The present moment is never going anywhere or coming from anywhere. This present moment is unmoving, timeless present. That's coterminous with the mind, with awareness. The mind also doesn't have to move. As the present moment just is, so can the mind be. And one of the things that gets the mind to move is pleasure and pain in the body or anywhere in the senses. If there's pleasure or pain, that's which your mind is reacting to. For the last few minutes here, perhaps you can just let the mind be still and quiet, receptive, allowing, without moving towards or away. Something that causes the mind to move or get agitated is wanting something to be a certain way, or wanting something not to be a certain way. And if you find yourself that way, doing that, it's okay. But see if you can rest back in the quiet, still awareness that also is here at the same time. The unmoving mind that's also here. And allow yourself to rest there. And then as we come to the end of this sitting, often we live our lives, our mind is active on the surface of things, the surface of the mind. The ability to sit quietly, calmly, and tap into the stillness of the mind, stillness of the heart, which is part of the fullness of the heart, fullness of the mind, gives us the opportunity to meet the world and respond to the world from the depths of our mind, depths of our heart, the place where there is tender care, the place where there's feeling with the world. And may whatever connection you have with yourself, your deeper connection to stillness, calm, a sense of freedom, may it be as you go about your day to day that you stay close to that, return to that, so that can be the source of how you care for the world, how you make the world a better place for a few other people today. Maybe in simple ways you can be kinder, listen better. Be a little more generous in your attention, your smiles, your care. May it be that our meditation today serves the welfare and happiness of beings everywhere. May our goodness spread outwards across the world. So with this talk we come to the fifth of the 5 talks on the second Noble Truth, part of a 4-week series on the 4 Noble Truths. And as I said yesterday, the primary reference point for many of the interpretations of the 4 Noble Truths, that as they come down to us down through the ages, is what appears in what's called the Buddha's first sermon. And mostly some of the popular interpretations don't really take in all that it said, the teachings there about the second Noble Truth. They often will stop and say that craving, thirst, tanna in Pali, is the cause or the condition or the source, the origin for suffering. And that's a very useful interpretation, as I've been saying, that just having that idea can help people investigate their lives very effectively and see where craving or strong desire causes limitations, causes challenges and distress for people. However, and this idea that it's the cause is a little bit, kind of almost one way of kind of making logical sense of this idea that the explanation says the noble truth of the arising of suffering is that craving. So then just stop there and then just craving. So how is it that craving is arising with causes the rising of suffering? Well, it must be the source. It must be the origin. However, as I said yesterday, the full explanation is that it's that suffering, that craving that leads to rebirth or re-becoming, literally. And that what the text is explaining is not the source, the origin, the cause of all suffering that humans have, but it's the original cause, that from in a previous lifetime, because there was a craving for rebirth. And you don't get born into the world of suffering unless you crave to be born again. And so in this interpretation, it's the idea is to become free of rebirth by becoming free of that craving for rebirth. This idea for the 4 Noble Truths almost certainly didn't come from the Buddha in the way it's been formulated, and probably was composed maybe 100 years after his life. Perhaps a time when the idea of rebirth became increasingly important in Buddhism, in a way that doesn't really represent how important it was in the earliest period of Buddhism. But still, it gives us this wonderful interpretation of just the craving is the is the cause of suffering. Sometimes that's very useful. Sometimes that interpretation gets in the way. It leads to too much analysis and trying to figure out. Some of the other interpretations, conditionality, and especially inconstancy, that seeing that, especially in constancy, where the idea is that the noble truth of the arising of suffering is simply the arising, how it appears. And something about seeing something appear, where there's space, there's recognition, there can be even a sense of independence from it. It's there, and I'm here. We're not the same thing. And it's the beginning of a process of becoming freer of suffering. And so in a sense, rather than solving suffering and figuring it out, it's learning to have a different relationship to suffering by seeing it as arising and ceasing, coming and going. The explanation of craving, that craving that gives rise to rebirth, actually continues. There's a second half of it, which I would like to refer to today, and offer an interpretation which maybe is a nice segue into what we're going to do next week. So as I said yesterday, I'm reading Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation, and he uses the word origin for samudaya, the word that means arising. He translates origin, and now we understand why he does that, because it's this original craving that gives rise to birth. Now this, bhikkhus, is the noble truth of the origin of suffering. It is the craving that leads to renewed existence, accompanied by delight and lust, seeking delight here and there. So first to say this, the craving that is accompanied by delight and lust. I think the idea in the ancient world is that this original craving that leads to rebirth, the kind of fundamental drive to be reborn is a kind of lusting or wanting of pleasure or delighting in the world. So we want more of it. So that's kind of one of the fundamental kind of concerns of some of early Buddhism, this idea of not having that kind of desire for the world that is just delighting, relishing in it, that keeps us going in the cycles of rebirth. And then it goes on and says, that is craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, craving for extermination. Bhikkhu Bodhi has this big word, extermination. That's kind of big and a little bit dangerous and sounding a little bit like violent even. The literal meaning for literal word for existence and extermination is bhava and abhava. Bhava means becoming, and that's a little difficult word in English, so many people will translate it as existence. But becoming, coming into being. And one reason why that's important is that existence can seem a little bit static. Becoming is a constantly dynamic process of coming into becoming, coming into being. That's constantly we're participating in a constant process of coming into being. And then abhava is not being, not becoming. So not having that process continue. So this the ending or the not becoming, not exactly not existing, but no longer contributing to this becoming. So with the idea of rebirth as the framework for this interpretation, that is when it says that there's the craving for sensual pleasure. That's really deep in human beings, the desire for pleasure, and maybe deeper than most people realize. And some people are a little bit put off by the constant early Buddhist emphasis on that being trapped or caught by sensual pleasures, the craving for sensual pleasures being a problem. But sensual pleasure means any movement towards comfort, any movement towards any kind of pleasure, not the more dramatic ones of Epicurean kind of just enjoying food or enjoying sex or whatever it might be. Many of the small ways that many people live their lives, is oriented around making themselves more comfortable. even like how we sit in a chair, or how we sit at a table, or how we might buy food that's more, doesn't, we have to pay more for it than we absolutely have to, because it's we get more pleasure from it. We might buy some clothes that are more than what we need, but we get pleasure from it. The idea of receiving pleasure from experience is really a deeply ingrained thing in human nature, and it's be one of those things that people crave, and in craving, they suffer, or can suffer, feel frustrated, feel upset, be driven by it. The next two, becoming and not becoming. Some people translate this almost as identity, forming an identity of who we are, being some, creating an identity, creating a sense of I am this, or creating a sense of I'm not that, not to be that, kind of a non-identification of something. And so, you see, and maybe in a kind of simple way is the clothes people choose to wear sometimes has to do with forming an identity, becoming something for other people. Whereas some people have the opposite, they don't want to become. So, for example, there are some people who are very happy to have logos, like of their college or high school, on their sweatshirt, and they've kind of assumed that identity. They become something, person from that school, or their sports team or something, or their favorite company. And then there's people, and I fall in this camp, I have a little bit of tendency to this abhava, non-becoming. I really don't want to wear anything that has a logo on it. And it's very rare, I think you'll ever see me do this. And I'm not particularly proud of this tendency, but it's maybe a little bit this movement, like I don't want to be. So that's my thing. And so this becoming identity. So when in this rebirth can be pulled in, the idea of wanting to be reborn can be desire for becoming, to exist again. The paradox here is that the craving for non-becoming, non-existing, because it's craving, is also a cause to becoming reborn. In other words, if a person doesn't want to be reborn so strongly that there's a craving not to be reborn, paradoxically, that very craving is what gets them reborn, because craving is such a strong drive and push. So in my teachings, in my practice myself, it's very rare that I'm making much reference to rebirth. It's not really an important part of what I feel like I want to teach or part of my own practice. So, but I offer you what is in the very traditional text, so you understand the full range of what goes on with these Four Noble Truths and all the different interpretations of it. But I am partial to the interpretation of this rebirth, or this becoming and non-becoming, as not being about being reborn one lifetime after another, but about being reborn moment by moment. That there's a constant movement we have of craving for pleasure or avoiding displeasure, movement of becoming something, identifying something, assuming an identity, being someone, asserting ourselves as being someone, or the opposite, not wanting to be and hiding or shutting down or avoiding something. And this constant kind of becoming and non-becoming, identifying and then disidentifying, it can be an incessant form of suffering, incessant form of ongoing manufacturing, constructing, concern, preoccupation for human beings. And this doesn't have to be. We don't have to live with an incessant preoccupation, a craving, an addiction even for some people for pleasure, an addiction to identity, to self, to being someone, to having a clearly constructed sense of self that we present to the world, or a clearly constructed idea of what we don't want to present to the world and hide from, And so when we learn to sit still in meditation, and that's why I did this meditation today on the stillness of the mind, is when the mind doesn't move, when the mind moves, it's often because it wants and doesn't want. And it wants becoming or doesn't want becoming. And even the idea of not wanting or non-becoming is being trapped in the cycles of becoming, of craving and suffering. And the interesting question, and this is the question that I'll leave here for today, is that if becoming is a source of suffering, and the opposite, non-becoming, is a source of suffering, what's the solution? What's the third option? If non-becoming just creates more becoming, more ongoing creation, what is the third option? And that's why I think Bhikkhu Bodhi's translation of existence and extermination is a little bit difficult to work with. But anyway, what's the alternative to existing and exterminating and ending? Is there a third option? And that will be the topic for the third of the Four Noble Truths for next week. So a couple of things I want to say quickly. One thing quickly. I'm very much appreciating all of you who are coming and joining and saying hello, and I think some of you are starting to feel a sense of community just from the chat box there. And I thought that perhaps next week, at the end of our Friday thing here, maybe those of you who would like to, we could switch to a Zoom meeting, and I'll post the Zoom account maybe in the chat box so it's not discoverable by the rest of the world. And if you would like to, have a little town meeting, a global meeting to talk about things or ask some questions that way. But also we can do some breakout group, maybe a breakout group where some of you in some random way have a chance to meet some of the other ones of you who are doing, been doing this now, some of you for many weeks, and kind of see what the pleasure is of and the value is of coming together a little more fully as a community. So we'll do that at the end. And now, if any of you would like to stay on, then I'll try to take maybe 15 minutes or so. If you have any questions you'd like to ask about this Four Noble Truths stuff or anything, I will try my best to track the questions here, and see. And the Zoom account we have has 500, big enough for 500 people. So I'm hoping that that's plenty, and that not every single one of you who are been coming to here wants to come that particular time. And we'll keep doing it, over, maybe periodically. And so if you miss it, it's okay. So, very nice that people are appreciating this idea of doing it. Could you please clarify if there's a difference between abhava and vibhava? Oh yeah, vibhava. Yeah, it's possible I was wrong about the Pali. It could be that it's bhava and vibhava in this particular text. And I don't really know if there's a difference. V is maybe a more emphatic kind of than A. A is not. Maybe V is a little more, has to do with a craving for not existing. So maybe that's why Bhikkhu Bodhi translated as extermination. I'll look at it and see, and look into it. And I think many years ago I kind of researched this, but so thank you for bringing it up. Have you written about the Four Noble Truths as you are discussed them today in any of your books? No, not in any of my books. I've written some more scholarly drafts of scholarly articles on this topic. And part of the purpose of this is that some of what you heard from me this week is kind of relatively new ideas that I've come up with over the last 10 years of doing some real in-depth research into the suttas. And so I've done some draft of what I hope to be serious scholarly articles laying out this very clearly how this is the case in the suttas. It seems that some of this interpretation about the Four Noble Truths being insight into inconstancy has been overlooked, even though now that I see it there, it's like this open secret in the text. It's hundreds and hundreds of times it talks about the text. It talks about seeing the importance of seeing, and it has other subjects, not always suffering, but seeing suffering, seeing X, the arising of X, the ceasing of X, and the practice leading to the cessation of X. And it's clearly synonymous with seeing the appearance and disappearance, the rising and passing of things, seeing inconstancy. And that this is really held out to be the liberating insight. And because the Four Noble Truths have been kind of like the predominant way of understanding the central teachings of Buddhism, that's been projected back on the earliest text. And we've actually missed seeing what the real liberating insight that's emphasized in the text because of this projection back of later interpretations. So I've laid this out very, very carefully, but it's not really ready to share with people because I need to work on it more, and a Dharma teacher doesn't have much time for that. So when I have some more time, I'll do it. Okay. I love this one. The idea of craving for non-becoming becoming makes me giggle. I struggle not to move because I'm more used to moving meditation with yoga. This is helpful. I'm so glad that I like the lighting. I figured out how to create a little barrier for it. I don't know if you noticed earlier, I was almost blinded by it. And so I hear aspects of dependent origination in this talk of the Second Noble Truth, specifically links 8 and 11. Can you comment on the relationship of these two teachings? Yes, this is one of the reasons why some people have the conditionality interpretation of the Second Noble Truth, because it's very similar to what goes on in the 12-fold sequence of dependent arising of suffering. And in it, there's based on sense contact. There has to be sense contact first. That sense contact is a condition for there being either pleasure or pain, comfort or discomfort. That pleasure or pain is the condition for the arising of craving, what we're talking about in the Second Noble Truth. So without some kind of pleasure or pain or discomfort, there won't be any craving. That craving is a condition for clinging. So craving is one thing, and then when it gets translated into doing something about it, it's clinging, holding on, and that leads to becoming, bhava, and bhava leads to birth, and birth leads to sickness, old age, grief, lamentation, pain, distress, and so forth. So it's very closely connected. And in fact, I said there are 5 different interpretations of that Buddha has 5 different interpretations of the Four Noble Truths, and there are basically 3 different categories of them. But one of them defines the Second Noble Truth as the 12-fold sequence of dependent arising. The whole thing, all 12, not just the end of it, is the arising of suffering. And then the Third Noble Truth is the reverse of dependent arising. It's a 12-fold, what I call the 12-fold sequence of cessation, dependent cessation that goes on. So there, the Second and Third Noble Truth are clearly connected to the teachings of dependent arising. Oops, let's see. I'm sorry I'm doing that out of sequence. It's a little bit hard for me to track all these with the chat when they come. Inconstancy is also translated as impermanence, question mark. Yes, the most common way in English of translating impermanence, anicca, is as impermanence. The issue that around the translating as impermanence is many people will interpret it to mean that something exists now, but it's not going to always exist. It's impermanent, so sooner or later, it's no longer going to exist. The day is impermanent because by the night it'll be gone. Mountains are impermanent because in a few 100 million years, some of these mountains will have washed away. The sun is impermanent because in a few billion years, it'll go up and disappear. But what's the Buddha is talking about is how things appear and disappear. And he has a lot of different words, languages he uses in Pali that are synonyms of appearing and disappearing, coming and going, arising and passing. And so it's really clear this is what he means, this ongoing inconstancy of things. And that means that things don't have to disappear and end once and for all. So the days are inconstant. They come and go. And they'll come and go until the sun, as long as the sun is, I guess, in the sky or something. And so the fundamental insight, liberating insight, is this arising and passing. So probably inconstancy works better. And anicca, what's being negated with the anicca, doesn't actually means constancy. So it makes sense to translate it that way. So yesterday, did you say that craving refers more to rebirth than worldly craving? So yes, I said that yesterday in relationship to a very particular teaching about the Four Noble Truths. That so there's one. It's one of the interpretations, and that interpretation is solidified in a sense in a text called, usually referred to as the Buddha's first sermon, and it's certainly the Buddha had a first teaching, but that this particular text is his first teaching is very unlikely. And one of the reasons it's unlikely is that there are parts of this text, some of the teachings about the Four Noble Truths that it teaches, I'll talk about later in this series, that are quite inspiring. But and some people see it as very important. If he said it at this very first teaching, if it was important, you think that he would say it again later. In fact, the Buddha is very repetitive in the suttas. He teaches things over and over again, exactly the same way, same words, in many different ways, and very, in the same ways. And so, if this teaching was really his first teaching and important, you'd expect it would reappear. But it hardly ever appears again in the suttas, maybe one or two other places, kind of in passing. And chances are this all represents a later interpolation into the suttas. Not everything that is attributed to the Buddha is likely to have been his teachings. And so this idea that the second noble truth involves the craving that leads to rebirth is not exactly an interpretation, though that's what it's become. It's for the early text, it's an application or an elaboration that when someone becomes fully awakened as a Buddha, the traditional idea is that then they will not be reborn. And the reason they're not being reborn is because the specific craving that leads to rebirth has ended. The idea that it's not really referring then to ordinary worldly craving. And so for that, those of us interested in how we suffer from day to day and all this, these other interpretations of the Four Noble Truths are much more useful, rather than being fixated on this idea of the rebirth, the craving that leads to rebirth. And excuse me. So I have a phone call at 8 o'clock, a meeting with someone. I love these questions, and here, so maybe this, if I saw this one. Oh, I like this question, but all kinds of questions, wow. Okay, well, so my friends, thank you, and appreciate all these questions, and here, isn't it impossible to not be becoming? The question is, how are we becoming? So isn't it impossible to not be becoming? Well, that's the cliffhanger that I'm ending this talk today. That next week we'll talk about the alternative to becoming and not becoming, and as we talk about the third noble truth. So thank you so much, everyone, and I look forward to our time next week and to setting up the Zoom for Friday. Thank you.